Today, we're going to create this layout right here, which is fully responsive without writing any CSS. Before we begin, I wanted to mention this video's sponsor, Skillshare.com, which is an online learning community for creators with over 25,000 classes in design, business, and more. So whether you want to fuel your curiosity, your creativity, or even your career, Skillshare is the perfect place to do just that. For instance, you're about to watch my CSS tutorial, but you could watch this full CSS course at Skillshare. Skillshare is also super affordable with an annual subscription of being less than $10 a month. But if you're one of the first 500 people to click on the link here in the description in YouTube, then you get the first 2 months 100% free. So join up. Hey everyone, Gary Simon of CourseCetro. So today we're going to take a look at something called TailwindCSS. All right, and it is a utility-first CSS framework for rapidly building custom user interfaces. And of course, I'm just copying this right from here from the official TailwindCSS.com site. All right, so basically what that means is instead of working within a CSS file where you have you're declaring your rule sets with your selectors and your different declarations and your properties and values, you're styling your user interfaces within your HTML document, namely within the class attribute with your different utility helpers or classes, whatever you want to call them. So we're going to create that layout that you just saw from scratch using TailwindCSS, and I'm going to show you at the end as well as how to optimize it within a more robust dev production environment so that your CSS is as tiny as possible. So yeah, you're going to learn a lot through this, sort of like a small crash course today. All right, so make sure to subscribe if you haven't yet, and let's get started. All right, so here I am in my console, and I've created a folder called Tailwind, and I CD'd into it. Let's hit code period. That will open up Visual Studio Code if you have it installed. It's a free code editor from Microsoft that I need to update still. And let's just get an index. No, let's get a source folder first and an index file inside of there. Hit exclamation point enter for some quick boilerplate. Let's call this Tailwind. And inside of here, we're going to reference just a couple things. So first, if we go to the TailwindCSS.com and we click on installation, as always, when it comes to either CSS frameworks or JavaScript libraries, we're able to either use a CDN right here, or we can use NPM or Yarn for a more robust dev environment. So we're actually going to do both. But first, because I want to jump straight into teaching Tailwind itself, we're going to do the quick option, which is just using the CDN option right here, which will contain everything. So the drawback, of course, is the file size. But the positive part is the fact that we could just jump in without doing any type of setup work like down here. But we're going to do this at the end because you're not going to want to use this in a normal production environment where you have this large, unnecessarily large, massive CSS file. So at the end, I'll show you how to refactor everything to make it drastically smaller. All right, so we copy that. We're just going to put it right here. And if we want any custom CSS, we can do another link, and enter. And we could put in, I don't know, we'll put it in CSS, and we'll just call it main.css. So we'll create another folder called CSS, and inside of here, we'll have a main.css file. All right, great. So the purpose of the project that I wanted to create here, I'm going to get out Adobe XD. I kind of created just a real simple layout initially for this, and I did this just yesterday, and I wanted to see, can I create this layout here using Tailwind? So something roughly like this. It was just a general idea right here. Okay, so the way I'm going to tackle this by teaching Tailwind is not by going through every single section, and trust me, there's a lot down here, as you can see. Instead, I'm gonna teach based on necessity, by example, by this particular layout example, and you'll find that that's probably how you will use it as well. You'll start off trying to develop some layout, and you're gonna find yourself all over the documentation until you can start remembering the different CSS classes that you're gonna be using in their utilities. So Hit Control Plus, make this bigger, Control B to get rid of the sidebar, and let's begin. So the very first element that we have here is this class for the body. So class, we want to make a, not a white color, but as something that's kind of like around this area, just a very light color. And we're going to say BG-gray-lighter. All right, and we're going to save that, Control B. And by the way, let's go ahead, make sure when you go to extensions, you type in live server and install that. It's already installed for me. Once you install it, it'll reload. And then that way, after, we can right click and open with live server, which launches a live server. Unfortunately, I already have it open. Let's try that again. Open with live server. And there we go. So we could see this background actually is not white. If I hit Control-Shift-I to get out the dev tools, we could see that this BG gray lighter actually has this color code right here, F1, F5, F8. Now, where did that come from? Obviously, we didn't define that CSS class, but if we come over here to colors, they have an entire color section right here, and these are all included in the file, the CDN file, CSS file that we included. So the way you specify a color here is based on first putting in a BG. So if I type in background for the search right here, this will take us to the specific section where we can define a background color. So you find yourself using the search a lot. We just simply put in, as an example, is just simply BG hyphen, and then the color that we want. And then also you can go darkest, darker, darker. No, darkest, darker, dark, and then just the color, and then light, lighter, and lightest. All right, so they give you the color swatches as well. And so there's quite a bit that come out of the box. So we used, what was that, gray lighter, which is right, well, it's somewhere. There it is. This one right here. So we could see that color code that was referenced there. So that's how we specify a background color. Very easy. On a side note, we'll see that when it comes to specifying a background image, you will have to use custom CSS for that. But we'll get to that in a second. So next we have this sort of a two-column, this div right here and this div over here. So let's get started with that. So we're going to have a div class, and this part's very important. We're going to just start with mobile first. That's how TailwindCSS is set up. It's set up for a mobile first approach, and I'll show you what I mean in a second here. So we're going to say div class block, and we're also going to put in a responsive helper utility. Okay, so what that means is if we want to define certain CSS classes that will only be attached for specific viewports, then we can put in the viewport name. So off the top of my head, you first have small, and then you could specify one of the utility helper classes after the colon, or you could do a medium or MD for medium. You could do LG for large, and then you could do XL for, I believe it's 1200 pixels and beyond. So that's the way that works. So we're using a mobile first approach when we say we want this to be a block based element right here, because the child elements, the two div elements for two of our columns, are going to stack on top of each other on mobile. And then once we get to medium and up, we're going to change it to a flexbox display. So the way we do that is MD and then flex. Hopefully that makes sense, but you're going to see if it doesn't make sense, you'll see how it makes sense when I demonstrate it in the browser here momentarily. Right now, there's nothing to show, so it won't make too much sense. But although we could go and check it right now, actually, if I save it, if I come right here, we'll see currently it's display flex. If we drag this in, we will see it's display block right now. So we'll see it visually, though, take place once we start to apply some aesthetics, some things that you can see in the browser itself. All right, so let's also put in a div class for our first column, which is the left darker blue column. All right, so div class, we're going to say BG. So we're going to first give it a color or background. So BG, we're going to make this blue darker. All right, and we'll just leave that there for now. Let's do the second column, which is the lighter column. That will be, let's see here. We will put no background in. The background for this one is just going to be the background of the page. All right. So for now, I'm just going to leave that shut. And I'm going to put in our just an H1 element, which is in reference to this, and then also a paragraph element here. I want to get the HTML first before we start adding all of the CSS classes from Tailwind. So let's just get that stuff out of the way. H1, we're just going to put the Tailwind CSS tutorial. Also, we'll put in our P element, and that will be from Gary Simon of Design Course, whatever. Save that. Over here, we're going to have, in this part, we do have just like a kind of like a placeholder for an avatar. So I'm just going to use a div class for that. So we're just going to have div, and yeah, we're going to leave that with an empty class as well. And then also we're going to have a paragraph, and we'll say it is truly awesome. Man, we're going to have 2 of these, by the way. And we're going to just stick with one of them, and then when we have all the classes, we'll just duplicate it, because as you can see, we do have 2 of these things here, but we just have the HTML for just this one right there. All right, so that's all of the actual HTML elements that we're going to need. Now from this point, it's a matter of attaching all of these various CSS classes based on how we want to style things up. This is what it looks like currently, so obviously we have quite a bit of work. Okay, so the first thing I think we need to do, which would make the most sense, is wrong window there, is this. We want to get this aligned, this element right here, all this stuff lined up correctly. We want it to be 100% of the viewport height, and we want this to be around 50-50 in terms of the column split. So this is going to be based on flexbox, so it would be helpful to understand some flexbox for this to work correctly. So first, we're going to say, let's see, we're going to put in, there's a bunch of classes that we're going to need here. And we're going to start with this class right here. Now, if we're going to do the mobile first approach, we should be in kind of more of a mobile viewport, just so that we can get those classes out of the way before we start adding these classes, the responsive utility classes here. So I'm going to move this over here just a bit so that we can have this thing in view all the time. Okay, so the first thing, let's see here. I would like to add some padding. This looks horrendous right here, right? So let's add some padding around the type. All right, so when it comes to padding, let me get this out. Let's just type in padding, and we'll see. That's not really too helpful there. I know there's a section right here, margin and padding. Their system for setting this up is just you start the class off with either a P for padding or M for margin, or a negative M for negative margin, and then the side. If you want all of them, it's just going to be, you skip the side. So you just do, like for margin, you would be M hyphen and then space, hyphen and then, any of these numbers here. And so let's just add some, I believe we're going to add some padding right here. And the way we'll do that is probably target the H1 element. All right, so the H1 element, we're going to put class. We're going to say, okay, I lied. We're actually going to apply the padding on this div class right here, the parent container of our H1 element. So what we'll do is after BG blue darker, we want to have padding on the top and the bottom of this container. So I want an uneven amount of padding on the top versus and bottom versus the left and right. So the way we do that is we put in padding, so P, and then we'll put in on the top and bottom, if we just want to specify those two elements, we put Y for the Y axis. Then we put a hyphen and then one of these options right here for the amount of padding. I'm going to go all the way up to 24, which is equal to 6 rem units. So 24, if we save this, we have a fair amount now that have been added. But now there's not enough on the left and right, so we could do px, which is left and right, 8. There we go. Now this text color is really ugly, so let's fix that. So there's also a specific way to specify text or font color, and we do that by starting off with text hyphen and then the color that we want it to be. So we'll say blue. There we go. And then we'll make this white. So class equals, and we'll say text hyphen base. Actually, no, let's make that white. There we go. And let's see what else we want to do. We'll experiment just with this bottom part here. Don't worry, we're going to be adding more responsive classes, because if we go all the way out, we'll see it doesn't quite look anywhere near what we want it to be. So now in this section, we'll have sort of the same thing. We're going to have py, and we're not going to put 24, we're just going to put 12 here. All right. And then we're also going to have px8. There we go. So now we're able to add white space very easily. And we're also going to put in right here, I think I missed a class. Let's put div class equals blank. We need an overall wrapper around these two elements. There we go. All right, so this is going to be the white container. So if you come out here, this is this container. All right, so first we're going to need to make that background white, so bg-white. You can see it just barely. And then next we will also make this an inline flex. So what that means is if we come here, we'll see we have an entire section, if I can find it, for flexbox and their associated properties. All right, so inline flex is one of the options here. This is where it's kind of helpful to understand, to already have an understanding of flexbox. But all these sections down here will give you all of the utilities and their class names that you would use to designate and define those CSS flexbox properties for alignment and laying it out correctly. All right, we're also going to put some padding, so p-6. There we go. And we will also add, let's see here, rounded corners. All right, so we're going to put rounded and full. All right, so actually I'm wrong about that, rounded large. So they're kind of hard to see right here. And if I come though over here and we type in rounded, we have rounded corner section. So we used rounded large, and it tells you what type of CSS property and value it's going to place on that. So rounded full, for instance, would give you a circle, which is what we need for the avatar. All right, so let's go ahead and do the avatar section right here, which is this empty div. Normally that might be like an image though, an image element. So what we'll put here is BG blue. We can't see it yet because we have to define a width and height, and you'll see that as well. First, we're going to put rounded full, and then we're going to put, for a width, the way you define a width here is width, or it's W hyphen, and then we'll say 12, and then height hyphen 12, because we want it to be a circle. There we go. So let's check real quickly in the docs for our width. So it's actually under, what is it, sizing. Let me find it, because it's just a simple section right here, sizing right here. So width, we'll see we have W1 all the way through 64, which would give you up to 16 rem units. And then also you can do percentage-based values, but if you want something to be at 50%, you just put width hyphen 1/2. All right, so I'm showing you the documentation just to show, you know, how you can teach yourself based on your needs, because obviously this simple layout won't give you everything you need to know going forward. So that's pretty good right there. Let's also adjust this part. This doesn't look very good. So for this, where it says it is truly awesome for that paragraph, we'll say we're going to have some margin. So we're going to say margin top, so MT hyphen 3. So it pushes it down kind of near the center. And then also we'll put in margin left 4 just to push it away from that avatar. This actually should probably be 4. Yeah, right there. That looks better. Okay. All right. So now let's go ahead, and I'd say that's, well, let's say we want a shadow on this. So there are also utilities for shadows for adding. So we can add a shadow on this element right here. So we'll put in shadow hyphen MD for medium. You could also put just shadow, which is a much more simple shadow. As you can see, it doesn't contrast as much. We could also put shadow hyphen LG for large. I don't like that. We'll just go with medium. And there we go. All right, so let's check out what we have so far. See, this is good for, almost good for a, you know, like a mobile approach. This, however, needs adjusted. Let's also center this text, by the way. And that's very simple. It's just simply text center. And we'll add it to both of these elements. There we go. Okay. So now we need to make this thing responsive. All right, so once we get to this breakpoint right here is where we want to make this height 100% and make some other adjustments. I'm going to adjust this actually. This 8 value is making it sit right here, which looks horrible. Maybe -12 on the margin left. All right. So there we go. Fairly simple layout, and look at our CSS file. So obviously it's just a matter of using those utility classes to structure everything right here. So it can get overwhelming looking at this though. So that's why it's important that you would really want to structure your utility class names in order in terms of your base styles for mobile first, and then medium, and then large, and then XL as well. All right, so now let's go ahead and try to set up a more robust dev environment for this, where we're not using a CDN of sorts. So first thing, let's get rid of this top right here. And we'll say this time, well, we'll just leave that right here. I'm not worried about that too much. Now let's go back to the installation section right here. And if we're going to use NPM, you're going to need Node.js installed. And so you're going to, go to nodejs.org, make sure you install it and download it with the default options. And then we're going to use this command in a second. First, so if we go back, I'm going to go back here, and I use npm, we're going to run the init-y command to create a package.json file with all the default options here. So if we go back, you're going to see, of course, hit Control-B, our package.json file. So we're going to install our Tailwind and run this command right here. I'm just going to copy that. And this is going to install it in a node modules folder as a dev dependency in our package.json file. And there we go. So we can also run this command right here, npx rather, tailwind init. And this npx command is just going to look in our node modules folder and run tailwind and with the init command. And it's going to generate our tailwind configuration file for us. So we'll go back here and I'm going to type that in, and we're going to call this just Tailwind, and I believe the file name is going to be .js. So this will run through, and there we go. So if we come back to our code editor, we're going to find tailwind.js. This is where by the way, this file is only generated once. You're free to modify this configuration file based on your needs. Now, one of the ways that you can drastically cut down the size of your app is by removing any of these colors that you're just not using in your UI. And there's a lot of other things that you can remove here, but that's not the ideal method. Really, you don't have to touch anything in here for the purpose of trying to reduce the file size. Instead, we're going to use PostCSS with a few different things such as CSSNano in auto prefixer, and CSSNano, of course, will help reduce file size automatically. And we'll also use PurgeCSS, which means it's going to get rid of any CSS rule sets that aren't being used based on what it finds in your HTML. And so that's the ultimate way to drastically reduce the size of everything that you have going on. So next, if we go back to the documentation, it's a pretty solid documentation here to help you understand how to get working. So the next step is using Tailwind in your CSS. So we have this JS file, but we don't have the CDN anymore. So we actually have to import our pre-flight, as it's called, our components and your utilities. All right, so feel free to read through all these comments. I'm just going to copy this to this, and we're going to create we're going to go back up to our main.css file, and we're just going to import these. I'm going to get rid of all the comments. Like that. Just like that. Now, of course, at Tailwind, CSS doesn't understand what that is, but the Tailwind itself, when it's ran, will know what to do when it finds this. All right. So next, if we go back to the documentation, you can process your CSS now with Tailwind. So we can run this npx tailwind command once again, and then we can just simply build and run this command here with -c. Which we don't have to put that. This is optional. It's going to look for tailwind.js by default. But you also have to put in your output, and I believe that's it. So your input file and your output file. All right, so let's run that real quickly. So our input file is actually in source CSS main.css. So if I go back to our console here, it's in let's see here, CSS, and no, it's in source CSS, and then main.css, and the output file, we'll just say, let's see where we're currently looking at inside of our file here. So if we go back to index.html, it's looking for CSS main.css, but we'll just make ours look for in a different folder, maybe called dist, and we'll make this tailwind.css. All right, so this is what we're going to want to specify right there, like that. So with any luck, it will work, and there we go. So now we can go back. We have our dist file, and we have our CSS file. Quite large, as you can see, and that's because we have not yet integrated PostCSS. So I mean, you know, there's how many lines of code here? 28,000. Let's check the file size of this. So if I reveal in Explorer, this thing is 394K. Of course, it's not minified or anything, but still, it's going to be large even after that process when we have all these rule sets in there by default anyhow. Nonetheless, though, this should still be working, and it is, as you can see. Okay, so now let's use something like PostCSS, because once again, if we go back here, it's going to give you instructions about how to use Tailwind with PostCSS, also with Webpack, also with gulp, the task runner, Laravel mix, Webpack Encore, brunch, just a lot of different ways to set this up. So what we'll do is we're going to install just a few things here. So we're going to go back to our console. We're going to run npm, and we're going to run I for install, and we're going to install, let's see, PostCSS, also the PostCSS CLI, the command line interface. We're going to install CSSNano, and we're going to include that as a part of our PostCSS process, as well as PurgeCSS. The location of that is at /postcss-PurgeCSS. And I think that's going to be all that we need to run. All right, it's done. By the way, I forgot to add the save dev flag. You're going to want to add that as well in a real project. Also, we're going to add as a regular dependency npm I watch, and just like that. And this is going to allow us to, at the end, run a watch command just for live reloading. Okay, so now if we come back, we're going to create a PostCSS configuration file. I actually have a mini crash course on PostCSS that I released last year, I believe. So you can check that out if you want to learn more about PostCSS. So it's postcss.config.json file right here. And this is where our config will go. All right, so first we're going to define a few constants up here. So TailwindCSS, we're requiring. We have PurgeCSS, CSSNano, and auto prefixer. All right, next we're going to have our module exports and a plugins array. All right, so let's end that right here. Okay, so we put in our plugins, and the very first thing that we're going to run is based on our TailwindCSS. All right, so we call that, and we point to the TailwindJS file. Next, we're going to run CSSNano. All right, just like that. And this is going to run a few different minification processes, I believe. CSSNano. Again, if you're ever confused, and because I deal with so many of these different packages, it takes your nicely formatted CSS and runs it through many focused optimizations to ensure that the final result is as small as possible for a production environment. You can learn more about it here if you wish. And then we're going to run PurgeCSS. All right, so again, PurgeCSS, one of those things that you can look up yourself, but here is the very basic setup. So initially, when I ran this, just like this, it worked, but it did not work. It broke the responsive nature of the layout. It wasn't including my media queries for some reason. So I did a lot of searching, and I found that the fix was in this piece of code right here. All right, I'm not going to even try to describe exactly what's happening here, but nonetheless, that is the fix right here. And then at the end, we run auto prefixer on the result. So it starts up at TailwindCSS, and it runs essentially basically the command that we ran by default here in the terminal up here. And then it takes that result and runs CSSNano, and then PurgeCSS, and then auto prefixer. And that should be good to go right there. All right, so now we're going to go to our package.json file, and we're going to create a script, just two different scripts here. So first, I'm going to paste these in. We'll say npm run build CSS is going to run the PostCSS client, which is the CLI we installed already, and we're going to specify this source CSS main CSS file, and the output is going to be put into a dist tailwind.css file right here, which is the same thing right there at that section. Then we're going to run our watch command. Now the watch command will watch, and again, this was from the npm I watch command that we installed. It's going to run this right here. So npm run, it's going to run this command and simply watch it in source. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's run our, and get this so we can see this here. Yeah, npm, we're going to run npm run build CSS first. All right, so it's running this process right here, and it takes a little bit of time for it to show up. But now, if we go back to our Tailwind, we can see it's been minified, and the size, let's right-click and reveal in Explorer, is 4 KB. So we went from that 390 KB file size down to just 4 KB because it looked and analyzed, which is the help of these plugins right here in our index.html file, and it was looking at exactly what we were using in terms of these classes, and then it discarded any of the other unnecessary, unused CSS classes in Tailwind CSS itself. Very, very cool. So also you can run npm run watch. I think that was what it was called. There we go. So now, whenever you make a change to your index.html file and you're adding those different CSS classes, this will rerun this command right here. Just to show you, if we go back here and I just put like a space here, we save it. It's going to take about 4 to 5 seconds, also depending, as you can see, it just ran, to refactor that. So that's why I didn't include it at the beginning. Every time I made a change, I wanted it to be instant. But because there are, it's a big file and there's different processes running, and it's doing logic, it's going to take a few seconds for that to run through. All right, so hopefully you learned a lot. I know that was kind of lengthy, but again, there's a ton to cover, and I really didn't even cover most of it, but hopefully me going back and forth between the documentation and showing, how I was figuring things out will help you in your own projects to understand how to use Tailwind. Really, it's all about looking at those docs and then memorizing those utility classes as much as possible. All right, make sure to subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you guys soon.